Since the end of World War II, only two nations have consistently been world superpowers. These are Russia and the United States. Many have speculated that these two superpowers will eventually come to blows. But what will happen? This hour-by-hour video will show you exactly how a war might pan out when Russia and the United States come to blows. While everyone believes that it will almost certainly come to nuclear warfare, we don't believe that it will be as straightforward. In fact, there is enough evidence to suggest that President Putin will be dissuaded from his generals to take this route. This means that we will be focusing mainly on the military aspect of a war between the United States and Russia. Let's unravel what could happen in such a scenario. It is widely believed that since the Cold War, the United States has always had a contingency invasion plan for Russia. The contingency is not to be acted upon, but it does prepare the U.S. if something does happen. Despite this plan emanating from the days of the Cold War, it is worth noting that the U.S. frequently updates these strategies. As geopolitical tension rises and allies come or go, the United States will need to keep this updated. So, months before the war even starts, President Donald Trump will be told exactly what such a plan could look like. Top 5-star generals will all have gathered to determine what the United States will do if something like this does happen. To ensure the military is prepared, the United States has bases all over Europe and Japan. Many of these will serve as the launching pad, with Brussels and Warsaw perhaps playing the biggest role in offering the United States a launch pad. Both these countries, Belgium and Poland, already have contingencies of U.S. troops, and they are also close to the east. So, you can expect that the United States will leverage some of these ties to help set up more and more bases. Keep in mind that, in such a situation, these countries will have already experienced some of the fallout. But before we can look at such a war, we need to understand what could set it off. Before we look at this war, subscribe to our channel for your daily dose of the military report. Since 2022, Russia has been conducting various military operations in Ukraine. This started with a full-scale invasion, but once NATO joined hands with Ukraine, they slowly drove the Russians further and further away from Kyiv. Had it not been for U.S. support, Ukraine might have fallen rather quickly to Russia. This is the mentality emanating from the Kremlin, with some of its top generals saying that Russia should have pushed further in 2014, when Ukraine didn't have a military to speak of. But fighting in Ukraine doesn't have any way of becoming a threat to the U.S. Ukraine is not a part of NATO, and they don't have any close ties to the U.S. whatsoever. In fact, the fall of Ukraine would do absolutely nothing to harm the United States. Unfortunately, it is not the same for Europe. History has proven on many occasions how a superpower can sweep through a continent and disrupt everything. So, there are only two physical ways that could lead to President Trump calling everyone into the Situation Room and declaring war on Russia. The first is if Russia directly attacks the United States or brings harm to the nation in any specific way. Secondly, Russia could choose to move from Ukraine and target some of the Baltic countries. Countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Finland can quickly fall to the Russians due to their lack of military and the overwhelming force Russia currently has. So, to ignite this war, Russia will need to do something, and it could very well be an invasion of these Baltic nations. Since they form part of NATO, it will automatically drag the United States into the war. Under Article 5 of NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. The United States will have absolutely no choice but to stand up to Russia and defend these countries. It is speculated that warships, the USS Kearsarge LHD-3, Amphib USS Gunston Hall LSD-44, guided missile destroyer USS Gravely DDG-107, and command ship USS Mount Whitney LCC-20 are all currently operating in the Baltic Sea. This is a small ocean body that creates a divide between these nations, but also gives direct access to Russia. If these Baltic nations fall, the United States will almost certainly move one of the carrier strike forces into the Baltic. These large groups of ships often operate with an aircraft carrier as its flagship. First of all, the United States will launch various reconnaissance missions. Use of the B-2 stealth bomber will play a big role in gathering intelligence, with a large contingency of drones also operating on an intelligence basis. Instead of replicating Normandy, the United States will first need to see what happens when they come face-to-face with Russia. Launching a full-scale counterattack might run the risk of immediately plunging the world into nuclear warfare. Upon landing on the coast of Norway, the United States will slowly begin pushing Russia back to its own territory. To help protect the Baltic infrastructure, bombing raids will be kept to a minimum and mostly used in a strategic capacity, along with ground forces. Another major operation will be launched from the south, with troops possibly landing in Sweden. This will follow numerous rounds of airstrikes on Russian ships in the Baltic Sea. However, once both sets of US troops have landed in these countries, they will slowly create a pincer movement. Russia will naturally retreat, fearing any form of encirclement, which means that within a couple of hours, Russia could be pushed back into its own territory. Keep in mind that the war between Ukraine and Russia will also continue ramping up, which means that Russia will only have limited forces that can be deployed to the Baltic. By now, the United States has already established air superiority. Moreover, Russian forces will be repelled back into their own borders, and a likely standoff, lasting a few days, might ensue around the Murmansk Oblast in the north of the country. This is on the Russian border with Finland and also near many Russian military bases. It will not be easy to take. However, with both Poland and Lithuania a part of NATO, the United States will also turn their direction to Kaliningrad. Again, taking this region will not be easy, especially with it already being a military stronghold from where the Russian Baltic Fleet operates. However, using both Poland and Lithuania means that Kaliningrad can easily be encircled, and should this happen, the special region should fall within a day. It is very unlikely that Belarus would defend this area, and with Russia now preoccupied on its northern border, while dealing with ramped-up Ukraine advances, the Russian military will be unable to also defend Kaliningrad. Meanwhile, the United States also has a few bases in Turkey. The Incirlik Air Base, located near Adana, is a great launch point as the war spills over into the Baltic Sea. But again, here the United States holds a distinct base and advantage. Within the first 24 hours, the U.S. would use this base and the Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base, MKAB, in Romania to move some of its aircraft. Thanks to the use of the F-16 and the F-35, coupled with a few FA-18 Super Hornets, the U.S. will completely eviscerate the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In fact, they have already started thanks to Ukrainian drones, which have already dented the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In 2022, Ukraine already sunk the flagship Moskva cruiser, which has naturally forced Russia to move its fleet more east. The majority of this fleet has already been moved further east to Novorossiysk. Unfortunately, the U.S. will not be able to enter the Black Sea due to Turkey invoking the Montreux Convention, which permits the country to close both the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits to any military ships. This has been very important for the Ukraine war, making it virtually impossible for Russia to continue supplying resources to the Black Sea. So, the U.S. will need to rely on the Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base to launch numerous airstrikes on these ships. This will all be done within the first 24 hours, opening up a brand new front, further stretching Russian troops. Up until now, the United States has launched its operation from NATO countries, but with Crimea offering a valuable strategic advantage, U.S. troops will slowly enter the southern part of Ukraine. First to fall would be Odessa, giving the United States port access, and then Mariupol. Battles here will be ferocious, as Russia already understands what it means if they lose Crimea. Moreover, a bridge stretching from Russia to Crimea will be a pivotal target. Since Russia heavily relies on this to reinforce its troops, targeting the bridge with a drone or aerial strike will seriously damage the resupply of Russian troops. Moving at lightning speeds, the United States may likely destroy it. This will naturally isolate Russians in Crimea, leading to a quick victory for the US and reclaiming the disputed territory of Crimea for Ukraine. Let's face it, this will not be an easy or quick war, and it could possibly take years for the US to make it all the way to Moscow. After 1 week, the battle for the Murmansk Oblast would likely still be underway, with Russia diverting some of its troops from the east to help protect the area. However, the US will now have also set up numerous temporary bases and airfields in Crimea. This would become a launchpad for US airstrikes on Mariupol, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Since these areas are occupied by Russia as of this video, it will lead to some intense fighting. As the Russian position weakens in Ukraine over the first week, the United States might make one swoop to take both of these cities by force. By now, the Russian Black Sea Fleet will be destroyed or possibly hidden near the Russian border. But the United States will also divert their attention to the east, with numerous US ships stationed in Japan. Currently, there are 3 bases in Japan: the Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Yokota Air Base near Tokyo, and US fleet activities, Yokosuka. Launching from these bases brings the United States directly to Russia's eastern border, where numerous battles will take place. The Okhotsk Military Flotilla, or Russian Eastern Fleet, will likely be the last defense, which will encounter limited US ships. Despite Russia having a bigger fleet, its older technology and weak ships will be no match for the United States' firepower. It will likely be the 3rd US fleet to first make contact with Russia when such a scenario erupts. Despite not having the same number of ships as Russia, the United States has far bigger ships. If you look at overall tonnage, Russian ships add up to about 2.135 million tons. This is a far cry from the 4 million tons of the United States Navy. Naturally, it means that the Russian fleet will be ultimately destroyed, once again opening a brand new front on the western Russian border. Once the US has taken out this Russian fleet, they will likely move towards setting up a base on the eastern front, and this will mainly remain a base as the war in the West continues to unravel. But this will also be when Putin will begin thinking of a nuclear response. According to the Russian nuclear doctrine, Russia has the right to defend itself in a nuclear capacity when its sovereign territory is attacked, and this will likely lead to months of negotiating between both parties. It will come as no surprise if Russia launches a strategic nuclear warhead targeting a NATO country, which could affect millions of lives. Moreover, the element of China is also something to take note of. Before we continue, it is important to take a step back and determine who each nation will choose as its allies. The United States acts under the umbrella of NATO, which means that all NATO countries are likely to join the US in this endeavor. Ukraine will certainly ramp up its offense around Kursk, mainly due to the fact that they no longer need to spread troops down to the south. This will create even more problems for Russia, which will now be facing fronts from all directions. On the other hand, Russia still has Belarus, which is naturally surrounded by both Poland and Lithuania. While the US might not go through Ukraine, it could use Poland as a launching pad to target Belarus. With only about 63,000 troops and limited old military equipment, Belarus will theoretically fall to NATO quite quickly. However, its president, Alexander Lukashenko, is rather obsessed with power and might choose to surrender, giving NATO access to Belarus. Should NATO move through the country, it means that the whole Russian western border will now be under siege, completely disrupting the flow of arms and spreading the Russian border even further. A scenario like this is more than likely to continue pushing Russia towards some kind of nuclear retaliation. Moreover, China could be another wild card. With its strong relationships and ties to Russia, the world expects China to come to Russia's rescue. But this will certainly not happen. In fact, China is a growing economy, which has avoided unnecessary costs to spend on the military. This has significantly grown the economy, China will likely sit back and watch the war unfold while trying to play the role of peacemaker. Moreover, they might even move to Taiwan, which will be the perfect opportunity and could even lead to a confrontation between the United States and China. If this happens, Beijing and Moscow would naturally form an allied power to stem the US offensive. As for the rest of Europe, well, many countries will try to avoid becoming involved in this war. It could seriously harm its economy. This means that from NATO, it will likely be the Baltic nations, Poland, and France who join the United States' assault on Russia. Countries like Japan will also be involved on the Eastern Front, providing support to US ships. The only true wildcard is Turkey. As things stand, Turkey has the second largest active military in NATO, but it enjoys strong ties with both the United States and Russia. Turkey might not want to get involved in this war, realizing that it will naturally need both partners once the war has subsided. However, this could lead to complications with both Russia and the US, with Ankara eventually being forced to choose. Thanks to swift moves and rapid invasion tactics from the United States, they will dominate the war by the first week. Turkey will naturally want to side with whomever turns out to be the victor in this massive war. Since Russian oil and gas fields are found in the middle of the country, with some in the east, these will likely become targets for the United States. Should supply stop, Turkey will have no incentive to continue fighting alongside Russia. But there is even more to this war. In the southern part of Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Uzbekistan will find that many Russian troops stationed will be repositioned. This leaves the southern lines open. It is unclear whether the US will open a southern front, but countries like Kazakhstan might try to gain absolute independence. This means that Russia might have to deal with a few rebel groups launching an offensive from the south. Under normal circumstances, this will never work, but with Russian troops spread thinly across the country at various front lines, it could open the door for something like this to happen. Unless China and India get involved in the war, Russia will quickly find itself encircled, which will almost certainly lead to nuclear warfare. But let's say Putin's generals are not willing to die while launching nuclear weapons. Many of them might protest and even try to convince the Russians not to go the nuclear route. Moreover, a lot of trouble will also have started in Moscow itself at this point. Since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, various groups have come out in support of Ukraine. Many of these groups have naturally been struck down by imprisonment and even just forcing them to disband. However, the Russian focus will now be on the front lines, again opening up the door for many of these groups to slowly gain a foothold. So, while Russia is defending itself on all fronts, a new enemy might rise up from the inside. Should they gain enough power, they can overthrow the Kremlin, and this will lead to peace coming to Russia. The problem is that Putin is an absolute genius, and the chances of a coup taking place in the first few weeks of the war is virtually impossible. Putin will have all these protesters put down, while also entering the country to martial law. Under this, working-age men will be forced to apply for the military, and they will naturally be pushed to the front lines. Moreover, Putin can use these rebels as cannon fodder to shore up his front lines and keep NATO out for as long as possible. It will be very important to watch the war during the first 30 days. Many offenses are bound to stall, especially up north. With it creating a strong threat to Moscow, Putin will naturally concentrate some of his forces here. However, the United States might open up another front line in the north. Currently, the US Navy doesn't operate any icebreaker ships, which means that its naval fleet will be unable to move in from the north. Should they deploy the 2 Coast Guard icebreakers, it could potentially open up the northern front. But with the current situation on 3 fronts, it might not even be necessary for the US to go as far. By now, US Navy ships will already be close to the western Russian border. Most of Russia's military installations are found on its eastern border, with an unspecified number of nuclear facilities as well. Russia will scramble all forces to protect this. which should lead directly into the next phase of the war. After a month of battles on the ground, most of the frontline forces will have stalled and entrenched themselves. This will lead to aerial warfare. As is the natural progression of the United States, they will likely try to break down the Russian defenses and make it easier for troops. This means hundreds of aircraft will battle in the air every day while allowing U.S. bombers to drop tons of ordnance on the defensive military bases. While Russia will try to counter this by leveraging its own air force, specifically the Su-35 and Mikoyan MiG-31, Foxhound, in an attempt to counter the United States, it will not be enough. Modern F-35 and even F-22 aircraft will run riot on the Russian Air Force, establishing aerial superiority. Moreover, the Russian S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile sites will likely be overrun. However, these have also been proven to be quite useless against modern fifth-generation fighters, as was seen when Israel launched an attack on none other than Iran. These systems failed miserably to export quality aircraft, which means the U.S. Air Force will naturally run riot. As the United States takes more command of the air, various other military aircraft, including the A-10 Warthog and large bombers, will begin dropping ordnance on various Russian installations and military sites. Again, this will push back Russian defenses. From the north, the United States Army will slowly begin pushing towards St. Petersburg, which will be one of its toughest challenges yet. Russia will likely bunker down in the city, leading to months of war, where thousands of people could lose their lives. This is not to mention the displaced civilians. After the fall of Donetsk back into the hands of Ukraine and NATO, a major push toward Voronezh will likely take place. The South might be rambling with Georgian rebels making its way to Rostov and joining the siege that will be placed on Voronezh. This will again be a situation where Russia bunkers down, much like they have done in Kursk, trying to use the strategy of making it a war of attrition. Russia will likely stall the war throughout the summer months, while launching various counterattacks during the winter. In fact, the cold winter months will favor the Russians as they slowly try to reclaim some of its territories. Meanwhile, in the Kursk region, Ukraine will likely be bolstered by U.S. troops, who will naturally push back the Russian counteroffensives and slowly begin moving on Tula. At this point, Moscow will already be panicking, but taking some of the dug-in cities will be no walk in the park, was it day, son? Essentially, it will buy Russia more time to come up with a counteroffensive. In the east, the United States will still be setting up bases and moving some of its air forces. These will strategically target military infrastructure in the east of the country, with the main goal of stopping them from joining the war in the west. Ultimately, the first 30 days could see the United States come within 500 miles of the Russian capital of Moscow. This is still a fair way off, given that the Nazis could get as close as 12 miles from Moscow at its peak. Nevertheless, Russia will be losing more and more territory due to the influx of these large military groups, while the threat of nuclear warfare will become increasingly more of a reality from the Kremlin. Putin will threaten and perhaps even use chemical warfare as a way of keeping NATO at bay. But as this is taking place, the rest of the world should brace for not only inflation, but a guaranteed recession. First of all, the world is interlocked through globalization. Russia provides tons of oil and gas to various European countries, and it exports about 45 million tons of wheat each year. All this will come to an abrupt end. It could send countries like Egypt, Turkey, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan into famine. With the energy prices also soaring, Europe will see higher levels of inflation, which could lead to more pressure on these governments to bring this war to an abrupt end. However, the rise of oil prices will now continue pushing up inflation and making it virtually impossible for the average person in Africa to survive. So, when talking about casualties, we should think of these people, who will largely contribute to the overall death toll. Inside Russia, trade will come to a standstill, meaning that grocery stores will run empty and prices will soar. even those in Russia will begin to suffer, and it might return to an era of rations. Back in the Second World War, countries in the middle of war would give its citizens rations. They would need to make these rations work due to a shortage of food, which will likely create internal division and conflict within the Russian Federation itself. It is unclear whether or not NATO countries would provide aid to these people. However, they might use this as a bargaining tool. Once a city surrenders, NATO could send in humanitarian support. The word will eventually spread, completely demoralizing troops, and perhaps even giving a few small battles to the United States. Finally, international stock markets are bound to crash, putting the world back into a recession. This could easily turn into a depression, especially if we look at what happened in 1930 following World War I. More and more countries might choose this as a point to leave the war and focus on domestic policy. However, the United States is hell-bent on reaching Moscow and will endure the tough times to take a major military victory. We might also see the first ceasefire during this time, with Russia finally coming to the negotiation tables. However, it remains a mystery how the world would naturally react to something like this ever happening. In reality, Russia would have already launched some form of nuclear strike as a last-ditch effort to scare off its opposition. Unfortunately, the United States is not scared of nuclear weapons, and they continue pushing to Moscow. The fall of Voronezh, and perhaps even St. Petersburg. Petersburg will be damning for Russia, but it naturally comes at a great cost for the US and Russian militaries. Both would need some time to replenish its front lines, and attrition would quickly kick in given the speed at which NATO has moved. So, for the next few weeks and even months, we might find that the front lines remain still, while the world continues to suffer. Both St. Petersburg and Voronezh are large cities, meaning that they simply cannot be bombed. It will need boots on the ground and door-to-door fighting in the streets of these cities. This will be costly for both sides. Meanwhile, the United States will continue with aerial raids, where it will strike various Russian military facilities, and perhaps even focus on targeting Moscow. But what will Putin do with NATO so close to Moscow? At this time, all military runways and even aircraft might have been destroyed. Targeted aerial strikes will completely wipe the Russian Air Force from the fight, and this particularly bodes well for Russia. As mentioned, it is also very likely that nuclear weapons have already been introduced, albeit in a strategic form and not the large ICBMs that could wipe out the face of the Earth. While no one truly knows what the Russian president plans to do if Moscow is invaded, many believe that he does have a decent escape plan. According to a Newsweek report in 2022, Putin plans to escape to Venezuela should something go wrong. However, China might also open its borders to the Russian president. Through his years as president, Putin has made many allies, which also means that the Middle East, with countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and the UAE also viable options for him to run to if things are to go wrong. He will undoubtedly choose to escape, much like Syrian President and dictator Bashar al-Assad had done when Syria collapsed in late 2024. In fact, numerous other leaders and fugitives have moved to Russia and will likely need to repay President Putin in some way or another. However, reaching Moscow would take a lot of time, and the Kremlin will be able to find a response. After the initial gains made by NATO to the west, the war will naturally stall, and the front line should stretch from St. Petersburg to Voronezh. There will likely be hundreds of thousands of casualties, with the possibility of nuclear warfare already kicking off. On the eastern fronts, the US will probably slowly move inland, trying to disrupt some of Russia's manufacturing. Connections to China and Iran will likely be cut off at this point, meaning that Russia will be in a very dire situation. Moreover, the southern forces will be moving toward Volgograd or the old Stalingrad. Russia is undefeated in this major city, and due to it being a defensive stronghold, it could keep the Allies busy for quite some time. Another major factor to consider as to why advances will slow is the winter months. With inches of snow and ice, U.S. military equipment might not work, and no drivable roads might be available. This could see everything stalling for a few months. This stalling will also work in the favor of NATO. With each passing day, Russia will be isolated, and its people will naturally begin to starve. Again, a revolt in the capital is highly likely, which could bring the war to an end even sooner. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, has estimated that a war between Russia and the United States will see around 91 million casualties. More than 30 million will be fatal, with another 60 million injuries. Moreover, this doesn't even include the people who are displaced and won't have anywhere to go. Further famine could worsen the situation even more, leading to fatalities of people who had no direct interaction with the war. This doesn't even speak to the international ramifications it will have with the rise of inflation. So, how does such a massive war end? As the death toll mounts and more people begin to despise this war, peace talks and negotiations will take place. Most people expect Putin to either flee, or he might choose to move to another country. The fact of the matter is that the world will likely be so desperate for this war to end that it will almost certainly find a way to bring it to a stop. President Vladimir Putin will likely be the biggest loser at the end of the day, and Russia will be in shambles. A new Russian leader will need to emerge from this situation, which will likely be aligning themselves with the United States and possibly even NATO. NATO will not keep the territory it had gained during these operations and will want to restore Russia back to what it should be. Contested territories in countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia will also be restored to its former borders, while Ukraine will almost certainly be given NATO status. It will take billions, if not trillions of dollars to rebuild Russia, and this will have to be done over decades. The damage to infrastructure and the Russian economy will be unprecedented and will lead to extreme poverty. Countries like Belarus, who might have given up early, or even Poland, will see an influx of Russian refugees, while the world tries to fix the mess created in Russia. Ultimately, Russia will surrender before NATO reaches Moscow. So, will Russia and the United States ever go to war? It would make absolutely no sense for these nuclear superpowers to ever go to war. The world will be dragged into a nuclear war, which will increase the number of casualties even more. It is for this reason the probability of a full-scale invasion of Russia will never happen. Moreover, Russia might not have the strongest military, but its natural terrain and various weather obstacles could prove challenging for the invaders to deal with. It could possibly take years for NATO forces to advance on Moscow, despite the quick fall of Russian troops on many outskirts cities. The most logical step will be for the United States and NATO to continue applying economic pressure. Various forms of sanctions and other punitive measures will be used to strangle the Russian economy. This also respects the Russian nuclear doctrine, preventing it from going this route. Moreover, countries like China, India, and even Northern Africa will see massive financial damage, which will force them to prevent a war like this from ever taking place. It is also possible that the Russian Federation will launch a preemptive military or nuclear strike on the United States. Such damage at home will definitely force Washington to rethink its strategy or target Moscow. So, what are the financial implications of such a war? First of all, this will be a very, very expensive war. The United States will need to divert all its resources to Europe and Russia, leaving other parts of the world vulnerable. With the Taiwan situation also becoming very important, it could possibly lead to a vulnerability in the South China Sea. While the United States and Russia are measuring up to one another, it is basically China who will be the winner. Should China keep itself out of the war, and perhaps take Taiwan, it will be one of the strongest economies by the time the war comes to an end. The US could even be vulnerable at home, and this will naturally open the door to possible Chinese invasions. However, a new form of the Cold War will likely take place with China trying to focus on economic prosperity, while trying to harm the US on a subtle level. Moreover, a war like this would shift the international power balance, and it could completely eradicate the Eastern Bloc countries. Yes, China might become a powerful nation, but would quickly find itself isolated, and perhaps even the next target for the United States. In fact, a war like this will resemble a Third World War, with virtually every nation finding themselves affected by it. As the whole world shifts toward the war, further implications toward emerging nations might also arise, especially in terms of aid. As countries swift to wartime economics, which involves diverting all available funds to designing and delivering military equipment, aid will drop. Smaller countries, especially those in Africa and South America, would suffer the brunt of these aid cuts. A small taste of this can already be seen with the United States already cutting various forms of aid to the world. While a war between Russia and the United States could be a real possibility, it is likely never to happen. The use of proxies will likely continue. In fact, the US might invade Russia, but via Ukraine by continuing to fund military actions, or perhaps ramping it up. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for your daily military report.